There are moments on live television that nobody plans for. Moments that break right through the scripted smiles and the studio lighting and remind everyone in the room that real life is messier, heavier, and far more powerful than any game show could ever be. Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over 14 years. He had seen tears of joy, arguments between siblings, contestants so nervous they could barely speak, and families so warm you wanted to climb inside the screen and join them. He had handled all of it with the particular grace of a man who has lived enough to know that people are complicated and that the best thing you can do is meet them where they are. But nothing in 14 years of television had prepared him for the moment a 94-year-old woman stood on his stage, looked directly into his eyes, and screamed two words loud enough to silence an entire studio audience. "Arrest me," she said it again, louder. "Arrest me. I need you to arrest me right now." And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she told Steve Harvey and every camera in the building what was buried beneath the garden behind her house. If you believe that some truths are too heavy to carry alone, and that courage does not have an age limit, make sure you like this video and subscribe to this channel right now, because what happened next will stay with you for a very long time. Dorothy Mee Langston was born in 1930 in a small coal mining town in eastern Kentucky. She was the fourth of 7 children raised by a father who worked underground 6 days a week and a mother who stretched every dollar until it begged for mercy. Dorothy grew up understanding, the way only children of genuine poverty understand, that life does not owe you anything and that everything you want requires something from you first. She was bright in school, the kind of bright that her teachers noticed immediately, the kind that should have led to a scholarship, to a university, to a career that matched her mind. But in 1930s Kentucky, a bright girl from a coal mining family had a different path laid out for her, and Dorothy walked it without complaint. She married at 19, moved to a small town in rural Tennessee with her husband Earl, and spent the next several decades doing what the women around her did: raising children, keeping a home, and quietly building a life one careful decision at a time. Earl Langston was a decent man who worked hard and loved his family in the way that men of his generation often loved, consistently, but not always expressively. He and Dorothy had 3 children together, lost one in infancy, and raised the other 2 with the fierce, practical devotion of parents who knew exactly how quickly things could go wrong. Earl died of a heart attack in 1987, leaving Dorothy at 57 with a paid-off house, a modest savings account, a garden she had tended for 30 years, and a grief that settled into her bones like weather. She did not fall apart. That was not who Dorothy Langston was. She kept the garden. She kept the house. She kept showing up for her children and eventually for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. By the time she was in her 90s, she had outlived Earl, 2 of her closest friends, and one of her own children. She was small and sharp-eyed and moved through the world with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned that energy is not something to waste. Her granddaughter, Patricia, had nominated Dorothy for Family Feud as a birthday surprise. Dorothy was turning 94 in November, and Patricia thought a trip to Los Angeles, a chance to be on television, and a few days of being celebrated might do her grandmother some good. Dorothy had agreed with a characteristic lack of fuss. "I have never been on television," she said. "It might be interesting." Patricia did not know, when she filled out the application, what her grandmother was carrying inside her. She did not know that the trip to Los Angeles would become something far more significant than a birthday celebration. She did not know that her grandmother had been waiting for the right moment for a very long time, and that Dorothy Mee Langston, at 94 years old, had finally decided that the moment had come. The Langston family stood on the Family Feud stage looking like exactly what they were: a warm, close-knit, multi-generational Tennessee family who had dressed up for the occasion and were doing their best to enjoy every second of it. Patricia stood beside Dorothy, one hand resting gently on her grandmother's arm the way you rest your hand on something precious. Dorothy's great-grandchildren, ages 9 through 17, fidgeted with barely contained excitement. The family had won the first 2 rounds cleanly, with Dorothy contributing answers that were sharp, quick, and often surprisingly funny. The studio audience had taken to her immediately. There is something irresistible about a 94-year-old woman who does not take herself seriously and is clearly smarter than everyone in the room suspects. Steve Harvey had spent the early part of the episode doing what he did best, drawing people out, finding the warmth underneath the nerves, turning a game show into something that felt genuinely human. He had asked Dorothy about her garden, and she had described it with a quiet pride that was lovely to watch. She had been tending it for more than 60 years, she said. Tomatoes, green beans, marigolds along the border. Earl had built the raised beds for her in 1962. She had never let it go to seed, not even after Earl died, not even in the hard years. The audience had applauded. Steve had smiled at her with real warmth. It was the kind of moment Family Feud was built for, but somewhere in the middle of that conversation about the garden, something shifted in Dorothy Langston's face. It was subtle at first, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness replacing the alert brightness that had been there all morning. Patricia noticed it and felt a small, unspecific alarm. She had seen that expression on her grandmother's face before, usually right before Dorothy said something that landed with unexpected weight. The studio audience did not notice. The cameras kept rolling. Steve was mid-sentence asking a follow-up question about what she grew when Dorothy held up one hand. She held it up the way a school teacher holds up a hand, not aggressively, but with total and absolute authority. Steve stopped talking. The audience quieted. Dorothy turned and looked directly at one of the cameras with the calm, fixed gaze of a woman who has rehearsed this moment in her mind many times and is now simply doing what she prepared to do. Then she turned to Steve, and she said it. "I need you to stop the show." Her voice was steady. "I need you to stop the show, and I need to tell you something, because I have been waiting to say it for 51 years, and I am 94 years old, and I am not going to die without saying it out loud." The studio was so quiet that you could hear the ventilation system. Steve looked at her for a long moment. He did not laugh. He did not deflect. He pulled his microphone a little closer and said simply, "Go ahead, Miss Dorothy, we're listening." And Dorothy Langston took one long, slow breath, and she said, "There is a body buried in my garden under the east bed, beneath the marigolds, has been since 1973. Then she looked at the camera again and said, loudly and clearly, "Arrest me." And the studio exploded. Patricia grabbed her grandmother's arm. The children looked at each other with wide, frightened eyes. Several audience members stood up. Two production assistants appeared from the wings immediately, moving toward the stage with the controlled urgency of people who have been trained for crises but have never actually experienced one like this. Steve Harvey stood completely still for what felt like a very long time but was probably 4 seconds. Then he did what he almost always did in moments of genuine human weight. He chose presence over procedure. He stepped toward Dorothy Langston rather than away from her. He crouched slightly so his eyes were level with hers, and he said very quietly, "Miss Dorothy, talk to me. Tell me what happened." And she did. In 1973, Dorothy was 43 years old. Earl was alive. Their children were teenagers. Life was ordinary in all the ways that ordinary life is both a blessing and a disguise, full of small tasks and familiar routines that make it easy not to see the things happening just at the edge of your vision. That summer, their neighbor, a man named Roy Cutler, began doing something that Dorothy could not ignore and could not report to anyone who would act on it. Roy Cutler was well liked in the community. He was on the town council. He went to church. He coached Little League. He was also, Dorothy knew with a certainty that lived in her body rather than her mind, hurting his wife. Not loudly, not in ways that left obvious marks, but hurting her all the same in the slow, grinding, invisible way that was rarely spoken about in 1973 and even more rarely addressed. Dorothy had tried. She had spoken to the pastor, who told her to pray for the Cutler family and not to interfere in a man's home. She had spoken to a deputy sheriff she knew from church, who had patted her arm kindly and told her that domestic matters were complicated. She had sat with Vera Cutler on her porch more times than she could count, offering a presence and a safety that Vera accepted gratefully, but never acted on because in 1973, in rural Tennessee, where would you go? What would you do? The world was not built to receive women like Vera Cutler. Dorothy had understood that, and it had sat in her chest like a stone for the entire summer. On a Tuesday evening in late August of 1973, Dorothy heard sounds from the Cutler property that made her go cold. She went to the fence line. She saw what happened. She was the only witness. Roy Cutler did not know she was there. When it was over, when Roy Cutler had gone back inside and the yard was quiet again, Dorothy Langston made a decision in under 60 seconds that she would carry for the next 51 years. She did what she could do for Vera Cutler, the only thing left to do. And then she went inside, sat at her kitchen table, did not sleep, and began the long work of keeping a secret that she believed, with everything in her, was the right choice at the time. Roy Cutler reported his wife missing the next morning. There was a search. There were questions. Dorothy answered them carefully and said nothing that was untrue, only things that were incomplete. Roy Cutler, after a period of suspicion that never hardened into evidence, eventually moved away. He died in 1991 in another state. He died free. Dorothy had read his obituary in a newspaper a cousin sent her, and she had sat with it for a long time, and then she had gone out to her garden and pulled weeds for 2 hours without stopping. For 51 years she had tended that garden. She had grown tomatoes and green beans and marigolds. She had let her grandchildren play beside those raised beds and had never once shown by any flicker of expression what she knew was beneath them. She had carried it the way strong people carry the heaviest things, quietly, without complaint, and at enormous private cost. But she was 94 now. Her knees were bad. Her eyesight was going. And she had lain awake the night before the Family Feud taping, in a hotel room in Los Angeles, staring at the ceiling, and she had thought about Vera Cutler, about the woman who had died without anyone ever saying her name in the right way, without anyone ever being held accountable, without anyone ever knowing the full truth of what had happened to her. And Dorothy had decided that she would not leave this world without fixing that. Steve Harvey listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not signal to the production team. He simply knelt there at the edge of the stage, beside a 94-year-old woman in her Sunday best, and he listened the way you listen when you understand that what someone is telling you has been waiting a very long time to be heard. When Dorothy finished, the studio was so quiet that the only sound was her breathing, and somewhere in the audience, someone crying softly. Steve straightened up. He looked at the camera. Then he looked back at Dorothy. "Miss Dorothy," he said, "you are the bravest person I have ever met on this stage, and I have met a lot of people on this stage." He paused. "We are going to get you the right people to talk to. You are going to be okay. And Vera Cutler, because of what you just did, is finally going to be found." Dorothy nodded. She did not cry. She simply looked at Steve Harvey with the clear, unburdened eyes of someone who has just set down something very heavy and is learning, for the first time in a long time, what it feels like to stand up straight. The production team had already contacted local law enforcement before Dorothy had finished speaking. Within the hour, 2 detectives were at the studio. Dorothy spoke with them for 3 hours, calmly and in complete detail. She answered every question directly. She did not ask for a lawyer, though one was offered. She did not minimize what she had done or dress it in more comfortable language. She said what she had seen, what she had done, and why. The detectives, who had been prepared for the full range of human behavior, sat very still for most of that 3 hours and said very little. Back in Tennessee, law enforcement went to the property now owned by a different family who had bought it years after Dorothy sold the house. They searched the east bed beneath the marigolds, in the spot Dorothy had described with the precision of a woman who had known exactly where it was every day for 51 years. They found Vera Cutler. And for the first time since August of 1973, Vera Cutler had a name in an official record. Not a missing person, not an unsolved case. A found person, a real woman with a real story. Found at last because a 94-year-old woman had decided she was not going to leave without making it right. The legal process that followed was long and genuinely complicated. Dorothy Langston cooperated fully with every part of it. The prosecutors who reviewed her case were faced with something that the law does not handle neatly. A woman who had committed a serious act in a context of profound moral complexity, who had held a secret for 51 years not out of selfishness, but out of a particular kind of anguished protection, and who had come forward voluntarily at 94 years old with no motive except her conscience. After months of deliberation, and after extensive consultation with legal scholars and victim advocates, charges were not pursued. The decision was not made lightly. It was made with the full recognition that Dorothy's act had been both wrong in the eyes of the law and, in some deeply human sense, an act of protective love toward a woman the world had failed entirely. Vera Cutler was given a proper burial. Her family, a sister who was still alive, elderly and living in another state, was notified and was present. The sister had spent decades not knowing what had happened to Vera, had lived with the ambiguity and the grief and the unanswered questions that missing persons cases leave behind. When she was told the full story, what Roy Cutler had done and what Dorothy Langston had done, she sat quietly for a long moment. Then she said, "She was not alone then. At the end, someone was there." She paused. "That matters to me. That matters more than you know." Those words were later read aloud at Vera's burial service. Dorothy Langston returned to Tennessee. She did not go back to the house she had sold it years before, but she drove past the property once, slowly, with Patricia sitting beside her. She looked at the garden for a long time. Then she said, "It was a good garden." Patricia did not know what to say to that. She reached over and took her grandmother's hand. Dorothy let her hold it. The story spread the way important stories spread, not just quickly, but deeply. It was not treated as a crime story or a sensational piece of television drama. It was treated, by the people who wrote about it and talked about it, as something more searching than that. A story about the ways that women have historically been left without protection, without options, and without justice. A story about what people do in impossible moments when the systems around them have already failed. A story about guilt and conscience, and the particular kind of courage that it takes to tell the truth not when it helps you, but when it costs you everything. Legal scholars wrote about Dorothy's case in journals. Domestic violence advocates used it to push for better resources and support for women in rural communities. Teachers brought it into classrooms as a framework for discussing moral complexity, the limits of the law, and the difference between legality and justice. Steve Harvey spoke about the experience in several interviews in the months that followed. He said that in 14 years of hosting Family Feud, he had learned that ordinary people carry extraordinary things, and that you can never know, looking at someone across a podium, what they are holding inside. He said that Dorothy Langston had reminded him of something he tried not to forget. That courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act despite it. And that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply to tell the truth after a very long silence. He visited Dorothy in Tennessee the following spring. He sat on her porch, a different porch, at the small apartment she had moved into near Patricia's house, and they drank sweet tea and talked for 2 hours. He brought her flowers, marigolds specifically. She laughed when she saw them, a real laugh, and told him he had a good instinct. He said he had done his research. She told him she had started a container garden on her balcony. Small, manageable, just a few pots, tomatoes, some herbs. She was going to try a pepper plant this year, she said, which she had never done before. He told her he thought that was a fine idea. She told him she had been sleeping better than she had in 50 years. He believed her, looking at her face in the afternoon light, sitting in the easy quiet of someone who has finally set down the thing they were carrying. He believed her completely. Vera Cutler's sister donated money in Vera's name to a domestic violence shelter in the county where Vera had lived. It was not a large donation, but it was given with a precision of intention that made it significant. The shelter named a room after Vera, a small, clean, safe room with good light and a window that faced the garden. On the wall, in simple framing, they put a single line of text. It read, "She was not alone." Dorothy Mee Langston died the following winter, at 94 years old, in the apartment near Patricia's house. She died in her sleep, which is the death most people hope for and fewer people receive. Patricia was the one who found her in the morning, still and peaceful in her bed, her hands folded in her lap the way they always were when she slept. Patricia sat with her for a long time before she called anyone. She said later that her grandmother looked, in a way she had not looked in as long as Patricia could remember, completely at rest. Like a woman with nothing left unfinished. Like a woman who had gotten it right in the end after everything. Some people spend their entire lives looking for the moment when they will do the brave thing. They imagine it will arrive clearly marked, with obvious instructions and a visible reward at the end. But real courage rarely works that way. It usually arrives disguised as something ordinary, a garden conversation on a game show stage, a Tuesday afternoon, a decision made in under 60 seconds that takes 51 years to fully resolve. Dorothy Langston had lived with that decision every day for half a century. She had tended her garden and raised her grandchildren and drunk her sweet tea and kept her secret and waited, in the way that only very patient people can wait, for the moment when she could finally do the last and most important thing. And then she had done it. On a game show stage, in her Sunday best, at 94 years old, she had done it. If this story moved you, if you believe that real courage has no age limit, and that the truth always deserves to be told, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. These are the stories that remind us what it means to carry something hard and still choose, in the end, to put it down.